Hello and welcome to Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to connect the controversial questions of how and whether we should bring politics into our preaching each week. And in each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place or space on the political platform. And I'm delighted this week to introduce the Reverend Andy Fitchet, Baptist minister and authorised Methodist presbyter. So you are absolutely ecumenical, Andy.
Very much so. Yep.
Welcome.
It's all about the amount of water.
Welcome to Politics in the Pulpit. You are, in fact, quite political in perhaps a big P sense of the word. A lot of people have talked about being political with a small p. And Andy, I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about politics and you and what politics in the pulpit might mean for you.
Yeah, certainly. So you're right. I am quite political. I was a local councillor for 9.5 years. I am chair of my constituency Labour Party. I have stood in every election locally since 2010 and stood for Parliament whilst being the Baptist minister in the same constituency in 2017. So yes, and I led the charge for the Remain camp in my local area as well. So yes, fairly party politically active, as well as being politically active.
So how does that work as a preacher? As a minister in particular, I suppose, but as a preacher, how does that work? Is there tension there?
Sometimes. I've heard lots of people say things like, you can't be party political in your preaching, and I would agree with that. I think that's probably new. You can't in your sermon say, and make sure you vote for X, Y, and Z. Of course, that happens in certain parts of the world in the church, and I don't think that's a very good thing to do. I am quite jokey in general, and so at the end of a sermon, particularly if I'm standing in the election on the Thursday coming, I'll say, don't forget to go and vote, and make sure you vote for me. And if you don't come back next week. But they know that I'm joking. They know that I'm being a bit facetious, a bit tongue-in-cheek. But I think actually when you are talking about justice issues, you are implicitly encouraging people to vote a particular way. If you're talking about things like asylum legislation, if you're talking about homelessness, if you're talking about drug and alcohol abuse, if you're talking about those on the margins and saying that what's going on is not good enough, then you're implicitly saying, don't vote for the same people who are putting these policies in place because we think they're not great. They're not kingdom values. They're not kingdom policies. So I suppose I'm just a bit more upfront. I'm not saying that people are being secretive. I don't mean that in that way. But I'm just a bit more explicit and saying, this is not good. We need to have something better. And I come from a kind of leftist position on what I think is better, and others will disagree with me, which is fine.
So how does that work? I'm fascinated. Do you have people who have very different political ideologies to you in your church congregations who debate that with you, or how do they feel? How does that actually work? Or do you find that you end up being a minister of what I might describe as a kind of a leftist church? Like, would you end up with a kind of a congregation that looks like you politically and ideologically, or is there a way of creating space and good dialogue?
Gosh, I wish the church looked like me. That would be lovely. That would be a lot less tense. Or actually, it wouldn't be. It would be much more tense, I imagine. Arguing with myself instead of other people. No, I generally, in the area which I live, I've stood in 8 elections and I've lost 6. The area in which I live hasn't had a Labour councillor on the borough council since 1983. And so that gives you an indication of which way it votes, and the church is part of this society. And so I have quite a lot of people who I would fundamentally disagree with on political issues, but I still love them, and I still care for them, and they're still created in the image of God. I think it's really healthy to be able to have a good debate with somebody on a particular issue, whether it be political or theological. And actually, I find the political conversations much easier, because they're slightly more detached in the church than the theological issues. Because if you're having theological debates, that's about the God you worship, and that's about your perception of God, which is much more important in kind of Christian terms, often than how you think people should be dealt with if they arrive on a boat. And so I think it's really good to be able to model having a vastly different view, but still loving them and caring for them. because we've lost that. We've lost that respect. I've seen it over the last 10 years of standing in elections, particularly online. It's hideous. I've studied for local council wanting better parking permits, and the abuse that you get. You think, I'm not calling for us to secede the union and become Hampshire as a country. I'm asking for better parking. Why are you being so vitriolic? So I generally think the church has something to model in how you disagree well, which when you've got a minister who is also a councillor. And if I'm honest, I think most of my congregation just think, oh, well, here he goes again. He's off on one again. And they're going to pat me on the head and let me go.
Brilliant. Is there, I mean, you've mentioned parking permits there, but is there a particular issue or agenda or something that you'd want us to hear from your context?
Yeah, I think one of the big things which stood out in this election more than previous elections, particularly because we haven't been able to get on the doors, we haven't been able to knock on people's doors, and big global pandemic and all that, is the amount of people who are shut off from engaging with politics or engaging with wider society. And a lot of that is because of the move to go online, which is great. And we wouldn't be able to do this, what we're doing now, without that technology, and it's brilliant. But so many people haven't got it. And we've seen in churches, haven't we? Probably you get 60% of your church are going to be online, maybe 70%, but a good chunk will not have that ability to get on. And so when everything moves online, and like I say about parking permits, well, when you have people phoning up in tears in their 80s because they've got another parking fine because the council won't give them a physical parking permit because it's all on an app, but they don't have a smartphone, and the council refuses to do something about that. It just makes you go, why? What is the achievement? What are you getting out of this? It can't be that much more expensive to give someone something, but the stress that is causing that individual. And so those little things, I think that's the challenge, isn't it? It's trying to make our political life, as well as our church and theological life, as accessible as possible.
Yeah, there's a language for it, and we might pick that up a little bit as we go. So each week I ask my JPIT colleagues from their public issues expertise, what would they like their preachers to be hearing and thinking about and reflecting on as they're going into their sermon preparation. And so there's quite a few things in the news. Obviously, there's the ongoing tensions in Israel and Palestine, failure to come to any peaceful solution around that, and then with that, an increased anti-Semitism and Islamophobia actually in the UK, and just aware that that's both challenging there and then having a knock-on effect here. Continuing concerns around the spread of the Indian variant of COVID. I can get that out as a sentence. Whilst the restrictions are starting to lift, and it really adding to the case that our church leaders have been making around the people's vaccine and kind of pushing that particular equality agenda that we've been about. Obviously, in Glasgow, we record these on a Monday. And we've just watched over the weekend Glasgow having a particularly interesting moment, set of moments, but the one that I think we're picking up on is the really positive image of what it is to welcome the stranger, as that community sat in and made sure that immigration enforcement couldn't go in the way that it was happening at Eid in a particularly negative and vile way. And then also in Glasgow, it's going to be COP26 in under 6 months now. It's looming very fast, and the Pope has just announced that he will be attending. So that is huge news about church and politics. And then it's General Assembly time for quite a few of the Joint Public Issues team churches. And for us Church of Scotland partners, it's interesting that their General Assembly involves them welcoming the new moderator, who is Lord Jim Wallace of Tankernas, and the Lord High Commissioner, who's the Queen's representative to the General Assembly and the Church of Scotland, I believe. And I'm about to show my lack of ecumenical expertise there. So any Church of Scotland people I've just got this wrong for. But that happens to be the Earl of Streatham. And you're going to correct this because you're actually Scottish, Andy. So you can tell me how to pronounce that. I actually lived 5 years in Scotland, and I've just failed to get that right. And that's Prince William. So in terms of church and politics, quite politically churchy at the moment. The other thing I'd really flag to our colleagues at the moment, and anybody listening who's interested in church and politics, is to say that Linda Woodhead is going to be on is going to be giving the Cadbury lectures on how personal values are the new religion, and they're going to be coming out over the next 4 weeks, I think. And so I'd really recommend people go and find those, listen to those, because that'll be well worth a listen. I've got a bit of an echo on my microphone, so I'm hoping that people can still hear us okay.
I thought you just had an influx of mice.
I think we do.
It's very old vicarage you're in, so it wouldn't surprise me.
Anybody who's listening online right now and can't see that this is a bit of a quirky old cottage, and yes, there are in fact often mice. So with our looking at our politics on the one hand, we're going to turn to our scripture, and not on the other hand, but in complementary dialogue. And so we're going to find that our readings this week are all around the theme of Pentecost. So we've got Acts 2, 1 to 21, and that story. We've got Romans 8 picking up on the theme of the Spirit. We've got John 15, which is the advocate coming to be with us. So I wonder, Andy, you've had a little chance to look at these and think about them, and I wonder if there's a theme or a particular text that you'd be picking up and reflecting on.
Yeah, so of course it's Pentecost. For us, it's really exciting because this is the first Sunday we're going to be back in having gathered worship since Christmas. So this is the first time we're going to be seeing each other, which is all over the last few weeks has felt like kind of building up from Easter to Pentecost, which I think is the idea generally in church, but we don't do that, do we? It just kind of flows into one and every Sunday happens. But there's been a real focus on this kind of building up towards the birth of the church. And this is, for us, the start of that again. So it's really interesting. The Old Testament reading is, for us, is Ezekiel 37, may the dry bones live. As this idea of breathing new life into what was before, but it's still going to be different, which I think is a space lots of churches are currently in. So I'll be focusing on Acts 2 and on the story of Pentecost. As I was looking through the years of the lectionary, I was trying to see whether or not the last bit of Acts 2, which I think is the most political bit, the 42 to 44, is in there, but it's not. It's nowhere to be found in the lectionary anywhere in the year, which I think is quite interesting. So I'd probably want to stretch it out and have the whole of Acts 2 being read and go, look, there's a better way of doing life than the way we're doing it now. But yeah, so we're focusing on Acts 2 and on the Pentecost story, and not just in this kind of big event that happens, but looking at the beginning of the story where we've got these disciples who are huddled together, worried, wondering, trying to figure out life, what is next, without seemingly a clue what to do, and just waiting and hoping that at some point something will happen.
Yeah, basically quite a lot of faith in summary there, really, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
What's going to happen next? Yeah.
Which is what we spent our entire year doing, isn't it? What is happening? I don't really know. I don't get it. I'm a bit worried. I'm a bit scared. It will all pan out in the end, right?
Absolutely. I feel like I often look at the readings, and sometimes there's one obvious one that's got a kind of real social dimension to it, or justice dimension, or political dimension to it. And literally all of these, I feel like I could have done a whole podcast on one of them. And I think with Acts especially, I think just the sheer language. I mean, it makes this point, doesn't it? Who is gathered? Who is gathered in this? Every nation under heaven, and it lists a load of the nations. It's not quite every nation, but there's a lot there. And it's always one of those that people really don't want to read. If you're asking for readers,
read your own pamphlet. Get through those ones. Everything's fine.
Just say it with confidence, people. Yep. But here we've got these. We've got this huge list of nations and tongues that. And Willie James Jennings calls it first a miracle of hearing, not a miracle of speaking. And I'm aware that echo is back, so it might be a miracle of hearing us this time. But I think there's something, isn't there, about this kind of there's this echo of Babel in there, of suddenly here is a group of people who can talk to each other, who share a language. They can have a conversation. We know it because they're having a conversation halfway through about what's going on here. So they ask, are not all of these who are speaking Galileans? That means they can listen and understand each other. So if so, then actually there's they've probably got a shared language of the marketplace, because that's where they are. They're kind of speaking Koine Greek. They've got this, they're speaking the kind of colonialized language, if you like. And here is this kind of subversive spirit coming and saying, I mean, you can all understand if we use this language. You also all Jews, and you have a common story, so you may also understand if you use this language. But I'm going to speak to you in your mother tongue, in your native local language and dialect. And it's even more interesting because the Galileans are obviously mocked for their accents. So you've got this kind of mocked group for their accents, and suddenly being heard in everybody's separate own home native language. And I think that's such an interesting thing to start thinking about as we're preaching. Even the act of preaching, are we speaking in the language of our local community? How would we do that? Are we doing that? It sort of suggests something even about our own act of being in the pulpit this week, never mind what this might mean politically as well.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I remember being told once, I don't speak any other languages fluently. I don't think my German gets better after a few beers, but I think that's probably just in my own head rather than the reality. But I was always told, if you speak to someone in their second language, you speak to their head. You speak to someone in their mother tongue, you speak to their heart. And it almost feels a bit like that's what's going on here. This is not speaking in tongues as a kind of this kind of gift of speaking in the heavenly languages, which is quite big in certain parts of the church, which is what I was taught that this was when I was growing up in church. This was a miracle of speaking in different heavenly languages. And you read it and you go, actually, no, this is kind of Vatican II. This is about speaking in the vernacular. This is about making the mysteries of God accessible to everybody. Speaking to their heart, not just to their formal, to their head. And I love what you said about not having it as the colonialized language. This is, Greek then was what English is today. You go around the world, people are probably going to speak it. But this is about saying, no, God's not interested so much in you learning something new in order to fit. God's saying this is accessible to all people, and trying to make people understand quite complicated and perhaps confusing things by using language people understand is gonna aid that no end. Particularly, of course, leading into next week into Trinity Sunday, which I'm not going to talk about. But when we talk about making confusing concepts accessible to people, there's a really good example. And I think from a kind of politics and a political viewpoint, what we saw in 2016 was incredibly complicated negotiations and incredibly complicated ideas being boiled down into 3-word sentences. And then the trick, the difficulty was trying to say, no, actually, it's much more complicated than that, and explain the complexity. But no, I want to take back control, which is fine. You can want to do that. That's okay. But you need to explain why. And so here we've got these incredibly complicated things, these incredibly complicated scenes that are going on, but everyone understands them. Everyone gets it because it's accessible to them. And I think that's really important for both politicians and for preachers, to take what is something complicated and not to make it simplistic, but to make it simply understandable, which is really important in life, I think.
And maybe one of those things about being understandable is also who's doing the preaching, because it's interesting that here suddenly Joel's quoted, and it's about the fact that it's the daughters as well as the sons who will prophesy. It's the young as well as the old. It's the slaves. And actually the point is here that actually those with the power to do this prophesying, to do this preaching, to do this something different is in the underside. Actually, it's not the people who always did have the power. They're there too, sure, but this is the radical new dimension of the Spirit that that the Spirit is at work in the people that maybe social structures and power structures have dismissed and said, no, these are the people who can preach this, who can do this. And there's a Baptist theologian called McClendon who talks about the idea of this bit of scripture being the hermeneutic of scripture. Like this is by using Joel in this way, we're watching scripture use scripture as it should be used. The kind of this is that, this is what the church is meant to be, and we're meant to do the same thing as preachers. We're meant to say this is that, right? We're standing in the same judgment, we're standing in the same place of the same experience of the Spirit and saying this is that now, right? We're kind of, and so is it that on Sunday the person who is preaching in your church, or the person who's praying, or the person who's reading, or the person who's prophesying in some way, whatever that looks like for your local church's expression, is actually inclusive of those voices that what would be the equivalent now to being female? Well, maybe still being female. What would be the equivalent to being a slave? Well, maybe people who've experienced modern day slavery actually. Actually, and not to mention the huge racial inequality that is still permeated by slavery today. So actually, I think kind of what I kind of want to say is, who is preaching? Actually, I think there's something about the what we are doing as well as what we are saying this week that is really challenged in, like, these readings really challenge us in, and Pentecost is really asking us, where is the Spirit at work in your church, and therefore whose voice are you meant to be listening to, and how do we raise that voice up and give it a space? Because this is
absolutely. And this is the community preaching, isn't it? This is not one person standing up and saying, this is, are these people not Galileans that we're hearing from the community, which from a Baptist perspective is ideally what we want to be doing. And interestingly, you said about the Spirit being poured out on all people. And you saw that in the beginning of the chapter. Now, Luke firmly places this story within Judaism and repeatedly places it firmly within the established religion. But it's a kind of a subversive change to what's gone before. So you saw 120 people, the number 120, with the women including of course Mary, the mother of Jesus. Jewish law, 120 men needed to form a synagogue and a council. Well, now 120 people are here. This very subtle but really radical opening up and enlarging of the tent, but it's still happening firmly within the tradition. Luke is really wanting to say, this is legit, this is okay, this is what's going on, is firmly in the tradition, but the system needs to change. And I think there's something prophetic in that, which is working within the system as much as possible to change it from the inside out and from the kind of bottom up. I'm not very good at that. I tend to lean more towards a curse on all your houses, burn the thing to the ground and start again. Which is a place for that, I think. It's a place for throwing tables and whipping people. I read that somewhere. But Luke's systematic change here comes from within the community. And actually we see the outcome, don't we? This took over the empire eventually. We can have a very long discussion about the merits of Christianity within the Roman Empire, but this was not about saying, right, we're going to scrap everything else. It's about saying we're going to take what is good and we're going to reveal something of God which is better, but still firm it and anchor it in something.
And I think what is interesting that you've said about the kind of the tradition and how it's expanded is that Jesus is doing this, and it talking about this in a time where they're in the middle of ritual, right? And this is happening around him, where there's this conversation about looking forward to the pouring out of the Spirit. So in the gospel, we've got this conversation that's going on that's saying like this, but you're the temple now.
Yep.
And actually what's happening is shifting. It's the same but different. And it's interesting that there the Holy Spirit is referred to as the advocate in our translation, but parakletos is this really legal term. This is a term that is about somebody who defends someone in court.
You're a lawyer.
Yeah. And the Spirit will prove, and that's a word that's also kind of like accuse, examine, and testing, exposing, rebuking, refuting, despising, maybe putting to shame. You know, there's something. Yeah, this is a huge word, and I think there was a phrase in one of the commentaries I read that said the Spirit will evaluate the world. As its way of saying, you know, what's the Spirit going to be doing? It's going to be evaluating the world. I thought it was a really fantastic phrase. It's kind of this idea of it's kind of put into this kind of very legal context. And I think, you know, if we think about the Spirit, we don't tend to think of the Spirit as a lawyer, but there is
more body feeling, right?
Yeah. But then there's and appropriately considering what's going on at the moment in Jerusalem, the book I keep referring to, because I think it's just a tiny gem of a little commentary, which was reading the Gospel of John through Palestinian eyes by Katanaki. They say love is not an excuse to abandon justice, but an opportunity to pursue it. And I just thought, fabulous, that the idea, the kind of, you know, we can sometimes make the Holy Spirit this kind of fuzzy, lovely feeling, but here is, you know, the Spirit calling us into this kind of pursuit of justice that might look like legal, like kind of something legal. Actually, this is legal change and evaluating the world and kind of challenging it. So I was really struck by that, and was kind of building on what you were saying there.
Absolutely. I mean, I'll avoid talking about the Holy Spirit as the former director of public prosecutions, because that would be too Labour Party-ish. But I think there is definitely a role for that kind of accusatory, line by line, lawyery assessment of something, particularly if what you see going on is covered in smear, and you think, actually, this is not good enough. We need to do better than this. You know, I think lots of people who've been on social media have seen the video of the 10-year-old girl in Gaza saying, what do you expect me to do about it? I'm 10. I can't do anything. She's there behind a apartment block which has been blown up, and you know, no one can explain away or condone either the rockets from Gaza or the rockets from Israel. It's all hideous, and we need a political solution. And as much as I pray, and as much as I hope, and as much as I encourage people to pray and hope, and think God can do something, God's going to use a political solution, because this is the only way that these conflicts come to an end, and that requires a compromise. It requires that advocate, that paraclete, to say, no, this is what's going on, and part of that involves the other accepting responsibility for the hurt they've caused on both sides of this argument. And I'm not going to try and get into the argument too much, because it's, you know, particularly in the church, there's lots of differing views on the state of Israel and others. But when I see, you know, anyone who should see 10-year-old girls saying, what do you expect me to do? You want to leap in and defend? And if you don't want to leap in and defend and say, I don't know, but I'll do it with you, then I would question how close in step with the Spirit are we, when what we see in Acts and in Pentecost is Spirit encourage people to say, go on, I'm in it with you. I don't know what to do yet, but I'll come and stand with you anyway, and we'll work it out as we go along.
And I think there is the Spirit prophesying to the world, right? Your young daughters will tell us, and here she is, and her voice has been the voice that we've seen in her native language, telling us, actually, what can I do? I can't fix this, and I'm 10, but I'm being affected. And that is this moment of the Spirit accusing, judging, evaluating us as the world, actually, and kind of receiving the Spirit as from the other in that way.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've got written down here is my reflections, because I'm not equating this with Israel. It's a separate point. You know, when the disciples are huddled together in this room, this is 50 days after the resurrection. You know, those who killed Jesus and want to put to death this Jesus movement are still out at large. They've not disappeared. We kind of forget that the Romans are still in charge, and this collusion between religion and power is still going on throughout the whole of the book of Acts. But it's there in the background constantly. You know, their life is still at threat. People want this Jesus movement to be quashed. And so this act of standing up and the Spirit moving and them speaking these truths of God in local languages is an act of protest and an act of saying to the powers that be, you think you've won, but actually eventually we will. Eventually you won't be here, but we will. We will overcome what's going on. And when I look at what's going on in the UK and the idea that protests can be shut down just because they're slightly noisy, I think, what's the point of protest? Like that's entirely the point. They're meant to be a nuisance, and I'd love to see more ministers getting arrested for being a bit of a nuisance, for standing up for issues of justice and going, this isn't good enough. And actually, I'm going to stand here, and if you're going to take them, that's fine. You can take me as well. And the church can go up on a Sunday and try and figure out what to do because their minister's in prison for being a nuisance.
Being holy trouble, somebody described it. I think there's a really helpful reflection on that bill on the JPIT website, if people would like to kind of think about that. And there's a bit of a thinking in there about kind of what the kind of Christian thoughts about protest have been over the last kind of 100 years or so as well. So I would, and before, so I would really recommend going in and looking that up. It's got some really good analysis of what's going on in the legal terms. So actually, kind of looking at that forensically.
I mean, the Welsh protest was won by dissenters. It was won by the Salvation Army in Whitchurch, in the town in which I was first a minister of the Baptist Church, just down the road. That they gathered in their hundreds on this small town and said, we're not leaving. And then the Right to Protest Bill went through Parliament because the Salvation Army stuff went, no, we want to go to worship in this way. Thank you very much. And so, it's from this kind of Pentecost protest movement that even 1845, I think it was 1845 years later, the people of God are still inspired to stand up and go, no, actually, we're here and we're going to make a noise about it because this isn't good enough and we think society should be better.
We've kind of reflected a little bit earlier on mother tongue language, and we haven't really gone to Romans 8 yet, and I'm aware of times we don't have time to do it in depth, but I wonder if we need to kind of just nudge ourselves over to the kind of, I always want to pick out a gender dynamic. If there's ever a gender dynamic, I want to pick it out. But I guess what I want to say is something about this idea of the language of adoption and labouring going close together. And something about the idea that there's something being given birth to and but also adopted. And it's something, it's an interesting interplay really with kind of, we might think of kind of the language about there are no individuals anymore. There are only families, and I think, I think in the church we've kind of adopted some of that ideology in a particular way, and here the language around family seems to be very muddled, and it's both adoption and also labouring for and groaning for something new. And it's kind of, again, it's a very female image. And I just think, again, thinking about who's preaching and what's going on here, Romans is a book that would have been read by Phoebe. And I would really want to make the point that whatever we might be comfortable with saying, Phoebe was a deacon or a deaconess, and whether there's a difference there or not, but Phoebe was also a huge, she was a huge financial backer. And the idea is that she would have been a part of if she was part of taking this message, she might have been part of forming the message. And actually, it's interesting then, you've got some quite, what would have been considered kind of traditionally feminine kind of concepts around what it is to cry out for justice and look to a new future and birth something new, or being adopted into something new. And that actually that play of language is coming out of, it would be spoken by a woman in a first century world where this would have been radical. So I guess I kind of want to just say there's something there as well, in kind of picks up again on this theme of who is speaking and how are they speaking and how is it accessible and who's now being allowed in. And now she's a wealthy woman, we presume. But it's interesting, isn't it, that there she is named in the text, having this role of preaching alongside Paul in that way.
Yeah, and I think you're right. The text does feel a bit clumsy in terms of the kind of the adoption and the childbirth images all kind of mushed into one. But I remember being at my son's birth, and thinking this is the most holy and disgusting thing I've ever seen in my entire life. It was the most holy moment I've ever seen, and horrific in every way. And the advancement of justice is horrific at times, and is messy, and is complicated, and involves a lot of pain, usually from women, and usually from those who are marginalised, and usually from those who aren't in the position of what we historically think of as power. And so, where do we give the voice? How do we give the voice? But more than that, how do we assist? I recognise that I'm a white male who is British, and so I'm in the upper echelons of acceptability. I'm gay, so I face some prejudice in the church, but not really in society as much anymore as perhaps we really used to have done. But where do I use my privilege that to enable the kind of messiness to be seen and to be heard, and to not be explained away, and to not be put down, but to give voice to those who are going through the kind of messiness and the holiness.
And I think it's interesting also that sometimes we can reduce women to a role of birthing.
Yeah.
And actually, it's interesting that adoption is also used in there, and that actually there is this kind of with the tension of these two images together, maybe a way of saying it doesn't have to be that's kind of, the feminine looks like birth or whatever, that actually, that's not actually the defining image of what a family is, and it wouldn't have been then, actually, that you often would have been adopted as an adult.
Society, very normal.
So actually kind of this idea that, this kind of conversation that's sort of just, even in itself kind of assessing itself there. And I think I would, so I guess I would want to say, let's not kind of boil it down to kind of like women birthing, because actually for those women who can't birth, that's even more exclusionary. But what is an interesting thing here is that actually there isn't only one of those images used, both are used, and I just think that was really empowering as well. There's a lot going on.
Is enlarged and continues to be enlarged and should continue to be enlarged, and that's our job as church.
Absolutely. Well, I think we've done, as a kind of rapid read through these texts, a pretty good set of questions, perhaps, that ask our preachers this week. Even if we haven't provided all of the answers, perhaps we've given some thoughts to people about where they might be able to begin and think and go. And so we really want to say, Andy, thank you to you for bringing your wisdom and your passion and your political party energy to the table. And we've really appreciated all that you've given us today. And to all our listeners and followers, and just to say thank you for the thoughts that you bring and the dialogue that you have with us. As this comes out each week, it means that we constantly reflect and think ourselves, and as we're preaching each week, it's really helpful to have your feedback and your thoughts, so keep it coming. Use the hashtag politics in the pulpit, and join in. If there's people particularly you'd like to hear on here, please do let us know who that is. So let's go into our politics and into our pulpit this week with a blessing. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, help proclaim relief to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you.